Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 40 of the American pageant titled America Confronts the Post-Cold War Era from 1992 to 2000. We're going to be using the 16th edition of the American pageant. If you have an earlier or later edition or a completely different textbook, don't worry about it, the content's going to be the same. Here are the key concepts for the chapter. These are basically the takeaways that are located at the beginning of every chapter, at least in the American pageant. What I like to do is while or after I read the chapter, I take the key terms and match them up with the bullet points, and this will really help you organize and compartmentalize information, so I highly recommend you do it, but if you don't, that's fine. Just remember to look at these as the takeaways from the chapter. Okay, so first off, before we talk about Bill Clinton, let's provide a little bit of context to the situation. There were many domestic culture wars in the 1990s, and these led to intense partisan conflict and distracted the nation from its larger goal of defining its role among foreign nations during globalization. Obviously, foreign policy is no longer concerned about the containment of communism because communism is no longer a relevant threat, so they have to focus their foreign policy elsewhere, and they have to define exactly how much they're willing to participate on the international stage. The late 1990s, however, was beneficial as the federal government had record surpluses, partially due to the new technology industry, and we'll get to that in a bit. But first, let's talk about the election of 1992. Governor Bill Clinton of Arkansas was the face of the Democratic Party, with Governor Al Gore of Tennessee his vice president. George H.W. Bush runs for re-election but loses. And Bill Clinton utilizes the Democratic Leadership Council, or the DLC, and this was actually formed by Clinton and other centrist Democrats in order to shift the party's values from anti-business and helping the common man to focusing on developing strong defense and anti-crime policies. And it really shows the significant impact that market-oriented thinking had on domestic policy. Republicans, meanwhile, tried to focus their campaign on family values, but ultimately failed as people were more concerned about the economy. Bill Clinton becomes the first baby boomer to enter the White House, which reflected most of the American population up until this point. He also sparks controversy when he promotes the idea of allowing members of the LGBTQ community to serve in the armed forces. He finally settles for the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, where members of the LGBTQ community could serve in the army as long as they didn't reveal their true sexual orientation. In other words, just keep it a secret, don't tell anybody about it, and you can stay in the army. And this is later repealed in 2010 as you see the emergence of new, more liberal ideas. Additionally, in an attempt to reform the healthcare system, Clinton appointed his wife and prominent lawyer Hillary Rodham Clinton onto a task force in charge of restructuring the entire domestic medical industry. And the 1,300-page plan that they created was incredibly complex and ultimately led to no changes. However, Hillary Clinton makes history in 2000 by becoming the Senator of New York, which meant that she was the first First Lady to also hold public office. One thing you should know is that Clinton's deficit reduction bills were much more successful, and with the spending cuts and the tax hikes, the economy was thriving, and the question arose as to how to control the federal surpluses instead of reduce the federal deficits, which is amazing. He also passed an anti-crime bill that hired more police officers, built more prisons, and banned some assault rifles, but the ban on assault weapons eventually expired. So now let's talk about a series of unfortunate events, starting with the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. A federal government building was destroyed in Oklahoma City as revenge for a standoff in Waco, Texas back in 1993 between the Branch Davidians, a fundamentalist group, and federal agents. And it shows the lingering anti-government sentiment and shone light on these citizens who felt alienated by contemporary society. You know, the fundamentalists, they are people who live by the Bible word for word, and they practice very traditional ideas that contrasted the new liberalized ideas of the time. Although this group was particularly violent in this incident, their feelings were shared to some extent by many Americans who were disillusioned with the government after Watergate. One thing you should know is the Contract with America in 1994. This was led by Newt Gingrich, and he advocated for significant reductions in welfare programs and other conservative causes. And it really shows how Republicans are using this anti-government sentiment under Clinton's administration to further their own political agenda. And it also leads to more Republican representation in the legislative branch. One thing you should note is that in 1994, the midterm elections got rid of the boll weevils in the South, with most moving away from the Democratic Party. Remember, the boll weevils were Southern conservative Democrats. And now they're going to the Republican Party, marking Republican domination over the South that will last for decades. One bill you should know about is the Welfare Reform Bill, and this cut many welfare grants and required people with welfare who didn't have disabilities to find employment. Liberals condemned Clinton's acceptance of this conservative serving bill, but Clinton realized that he needed to compromise in order to satisfy both sides of the political spectrum. Obviously he does lean to the liberal side as a Democrat, but he has to find some balance in order to make sure everyone is satisfied. And he does in fact express his disapproval of some parts of the bill. You should also note the growing xenophobic or anti-immigrant sentiment that's seen through GOP congressional initiatives. For example, the Illegal Immigration Reform and the Immigrant Responsibility Act in 1996, and this occurred despite the growing population of immigrants, both legal and undocumented, especially from Mexico. Some ideological conflicts you should know about. There are increasingly partisan ideas. The Republican Speaker of the House suggests putting children of families on welfare in orphanages, as well as cutting Medicare and education spending. And this whole conflict led to the federal government shutting down for 27 days at the end of 1995. Eventually, the two parties find common ground in a budget package. So on to the election of 1996, Republicans chose Robert Dole and Democrats chose Bill Clinton. Both worked to get swing voters, but one notable group in this constituency were middle-class women living in the suburbs, and this is where you get the idea of soccer moms from. Clinton easily wins the election because of the thriving economy, but Congress remains controlled by Republicans. One thing you should note is that Clinton claimed the political middle ground on various issues. In terms of affirmative action, he promised to mend it, not end it. He criticized judicial attempts at reversing it, but he never actually legislated anything. It was mostly just finger-wagging. One thing you should note is that race riots erupted in Los Angeles in 1992 after a mostly white jury exonerated a white police officer who had beaten up a black suspect, and it shows the growing skepticism many African Americans had towards the judicial system. Additionally, blacks lived mostly in cities, while whites lived mostly in the suburbs, making the wealth inequality more tangible and visible. However, because of the civil rights movement, there were more black elected officials, more in higher education. And, despite all these accomplishments, remember, an education gap persisted between whites and blacks and worsened by the anti-affirmative action policies in some states. So now let's talk about the US on the world stage, foreign policy. Keep in mind that there is a good economy due to the Federal Reserve Board's low interest plans and the creation of new internet businesses, which means there are little to no problems domestically in terms of the economy. So now the US can really focus on foreign policy. One agreement you should know about is the North American Free Trade Agreement, also called NAFTA, in 1993. And this was a free trade zone that included the US and nearby Canada and Mexico. And this actually left many labor union leaders disgruntled, because they feared of losing their jobs to Mexican laborers who would do menial, cost-effective labor. Another way Bill Clinton promoted free trade was through the World Trade Organization, the WTO, in 1994, and riots erupted when Clinton decided to host a summit of the WTO in 1999, when protesters argued against the human and environmental sacrifices that would come from economic globalization. More free trade efforts were seen when Clinton tries to amend trade relations with the new industrial powerhouse of China after his past critiques on the regime's human rights issues. Meanwhile, new technology allowed for rapid communication and globalization by creating an international network of connections. However, this new technology put many human jobs at risk, as some were either no longer necessary or were outsourced to other countries, and you can see that you're developing this globalization of economies. Countries are interdependent on each other, and this is facilitated by new technology. And because he was so focused on domestic issues, Clinton's foreign policy was barely present, as he now lacked a clear focus on anti-communism. So the question was, to what extent was the US obligated to intervene in military and humanitarian crises abroad? Conflict in the Middle East and anti-American Islamist terrorism, specifically Al-Qaeda, soon became significant, and remained that way even after Clinton's administration. And the US's involvement in the Middle East led to a lot of backlash from Al-Qaeda, and this really becomes the focal point of US foreign policy. Clinton was scandalous in a lot of ways. Clinton had faced scandals from the start of his presidency. In the Whitewater scandal, critics accused him of corruption and illegal financial transactions during a real estate deal. A special prosecutor was called to investigate, but no indictment came of it, and despite this, conservatives inflamed every charge Clinton was accused of. And this gets worse when in 1998, the Lewinsky affair becomes known to the public. And basically, during his testimony for another unrelated sexual harassment charge, Clinton lied and said he never had a sexual affair with a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. and the special prosecutor from Whitewater began investigating all of Clinton's lies and provided a detailed report of his affair with Monica Lewinsky, which was presented to the Republican-controlled House of Representatives and charged Clinton with 11 possible grounds of impeachment, but the actual charges were 2: perjury to a grand jury and obstruction of justice. Democrats said that although Clinton's behavior was morally questionable, it shouldn't be considered a federal crime. Republicans replied that if Clinton was capable of lying to a grand jury, he could lie in matters of national security, and Democrats believed that this was, quote, sexual McCarthyism. Although people were disappointed in Clinton's moral failures, they didn't want to impeach him because they liked his political policies and enjoyed the thriving economy, so the impeachment proceedings barely ruled him not guilty. Okay, now on to the election of 2000. Democrats nominated Al Gore, remember Clinton's vice president, and Joseph Lieberman for Al Gore's vice president, and he was outspoken in his dismay about Clinton's affair. Republicans nominated George W. Bush mostly because of his father's name and his experience as governor of Texas. One thing you should note is that Bush wanted to return the federal government surpluses to the people through tax cuts and funding private sector programs like religious institutions to help those in poverty. Gore wanted less tax cuts and more Social Security, and at this point, foreign policy wasn't really a contending issue. Meanwhile, the country was split between Gore and Bush, and it was up to Florida to decide who would win. And after a 5-week political standoff with confusion and counting votes, the Supreme Court intervened and elected Bush as president, leaving some skeptical about the validity of his victory. One thing you should know is that African Americans mostly voted for Gore, which further shows how politics polarized racial divisions. African Americans in Florida, whose votes had been discounted because of the confusion, said that the actions were reminiscent of the Jim Crow laws in the South, that they were being silenced. Okay, so now let's talk about some other domestic developments that you should know. For one, women were now able to get jobs in sectors that used to be male-dominated. They juggled a work life and a more traditional home life, all while being paid less than men in the same industry. Clinton passed the Family and Medical Leave Act in 1993, which protected the jobs of mothers and fathers who needed to take time off work for family-related reasons. The family structure also evolved away from the traditional nuclear family. And one idea that you'll really see developing throughout this decade and in the following decades is the idea of multiculturalism, the idea of celebrating and preserving racial and ethnic diversity of the country instead of squashing it. Minorities advocated for a broader curriculum that talked about the achievements made by African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and Native Americans. But some argued that this would take away from national unity by focusing on differences. However, if your national unity rests on keeping minorities underrepresented and focusing on one existence, one gender, one race, it's ultimately going to lead to disunity among minorities. So that's my opinion on that. I digress. Another idea you should know about is postmodernism, which celebrated these various perspectives, experiences, and identities that came from diversity, and this was reflected in art, literature, and music. Many of these targeted niche audiences, certain minorities, etc. And one person you should just know about is Toni Morrison. She's the first African American to win a Nobel Prize in Literature. That about does it for this chapter. These are the credits for how we got all the information you just saw. Thank you so much for watching. Comment down below if you have any questions, and be sure to like and subscribe.